Alright guys, how's it going? This is my review of Nvidia's GTX 1080 Founders Edition. Now, I don't actually have a GTX 1080 Founders Edition, but I don't really need one because of the rather strange, bizarre way in which Nvidia has chosen to launch this graphics card. It is a paper launch, there is no denying that. The reviews are out and you still can't buy the card. Paper launches, I don't really care about. As far as I'm concerned, companies are free to launch their cards whenever they want. Launching a card makes no damn difference unless I've actually got cards to sell. I don't understand why Nvidia has chosen to do this. It's a very, very strange launch. One of the weirdest I can remember. So I don't have a card, but what I do have is a bunch of information from those that did. So this review is about taking the best and the worst of those reviews and forming what I believe is a truer picture of the card. So let's get on with it. Right, so the card itself, the GeForce GTX 1080 Founders Edition. Now this Founders Edition card is simply a reference card with a new name and a higher price tag. So people can be forgiven for believing that it was something else, given that it's got a $100 higher price tag, but this is simply a reference spec card. Now the reference spec is exactly what it sounds like, and Nvidia sets the parameters for this. For example, the base clock of 1607 MHz, and the boost clock of 1733 MHz. In effect, this is the lowest spec that you will ever see for the GeForce GTX 1080. I suppose in theory, one of their partners could use slower memory. For example, instead of using GDDR5X at 10 gigabits per second, they could theoretically use 8 gigabits per second GDDR5. I'm not entirely sure why they would want to do that, but they could. There's a fair chance that that might upset Nvidia though, but we shall see. The important thing here is, the Founders Edition is the reference spec graphics card with the reference clock speeds, and a rather mediocre cooler. This is the difference here. Nvidia sells these GP104 chips to their partners, guys like MSI, EVGA, and then these guys stick these chips onto their own PCBs and use their own coolers. Maybe even some better voltage regulation, higher quality components basically. They can then effectively overclock the cards, which is known as the factory overclock, and we will probably see GeForce GTX 1080s with a boost clock in advance of 2000 MHz, and the cooling to support it. For the Founders Edition, 1733 is your boost clock in megahertz, but as you'll find out in this review, with the Founders Edition, that's not really the case. First of all though, we're going to start off with some benchmarks. Just how much faster is the GTX 1080 compared to the 980 Ti, the Fury X and the GTX 980 when all cards are at their stock reference clock speeds. Over at Texas at 1080p, the GTX 1080 was 26% faster than the 980 Ti, 55% faster than Fury X, and 58% faster than the GTX 980. Now you can probably tell that there's a larger gap than you would expect between the 980 Ti and Fury X there, and the reason is that Hexus only benchmarked 4 games, 3 of which were GameWorks titles, but the real problem seemed to have come from Rise of the Tomb Raider, which was benchmarked in DX12 mode. Now Rise of the Tomb Raider is a game that probably shouldn't be getting benchmarked in DX12 mode. The developers themselves said it's not ready yet, and we have seen in the past that there are issues with VRAM limits. And it is the only DX12 game where neither company gains frame rate when switching between DX11 and DX12, and yet almost every website benchmarked Rise of the Tomb Raider DX12. Pretty strange, right? Moving on to 1440p, the numbers are 25% faster than the 980 Ti, 54% faster than Fury X, and 58% faster than the GTX 980, so pretty similar to the last 1080p benchmarks. And finally, moving up to 4K, we see 23% faster, 36% faster, and 62% faster overall. The gap to Fury X is a little bit lower because, as we know, Fury X generally gets stronger as the resolution increases, and that's also why the gap to the GTX 980 has started to rise, mostly because the GTX 980 lacks the bandwidth of all of these other cards. Right, so over at PC Perspective, we got a few more games tested, but the results are pretty similar. The GTX 1080 was 26% faster than the 980 Ti at stock, 39% faster than the stock Fury X, and 65% faster than the stock 980. This was at 1440p. Moving up to 4K, we see a bit of a gap now, 29% to the 980 Ti. Again, the Fury X kind of holds on to its performance because of the 4K resolution, and now the GTX 1080 is 71% faster than the GTX 980. Moving over to computer-based 1080p, we can now sort of see a pattern emerging, at 28% faster than the 980 Ti, 41% faster than Fury X, and 60% faster than the GTX 980. Once again, all of these cards at stock values. Moving up to 1440p, and once again we see the Fury X gain, whereas the 980 loses a bit of performance. And finally at 4K, the GTX 1080 is 30% faster than the 980 Ti, only 26% faster than the Fury X, and 64% faster than the GTX 980. Now what I'm going to say next is I really liked Computer Base's methods. They go the extra mile, and now I'm going to show you why this is so important. This chart has Computer Base's 1080p results in full. Right at the top we can see the GTX 1080 Max, a couple of percent ahead of the GTX 1080. We can also see the GTX 980 Ti gaming there, only around about 12% slower. That is of course a factory overclocked card. And again we can see the gap to the reference 980 Ti is 28%. The interesting thing here though is what is this Max all about? Well, like I said, Computer Base goes the extra mile. This is all the games that they benchmarked, and unlike most websites, they actually bench inside a case. In this case, it was the Fractal Design Define R5, which is one of my favourite cases. Now if you think about it, all of those graphics cards, all of those games, benchmarked inside a case. This is a real pain to benchmark, which is why most websites use open test benches. Simply put, it's for the ease of switching out graphics cards. The problem with doing that though is you don't get the real story. I'm pretty sure none of you are gaming in an open bench. Most of you will be using cases quite similar to the Fractal Design Define R5. And what Computer Base discovered is that the GTX 1080 Founders Edition is unable to maintain its boost clock during a lengthy gaming session. Not even lengthy, we're talking 10 minutes. In actual fact, it's been discovered that after only a few minutes, the boost clock of the graphics card drops down. In some cases, right down to the 1607 base clock of the graphics card. We can quite clearly see Anno 2205, Star Wars Battlefront, the Talos Principle, and The Witcher 3 drops the card down to its base clock speed. The reason for this is simple. The card gets very hot very quickly. We can actually see this with some more testing over at Tom's Hardware. Now, I am not a fan at all of GPU boosting, and this is one of the reasons why. If we just look down the bottom here at 2 minutes, draw a line through that, and the graphics card during a benchmark run of Metro Last Light at 4K has still not reached its maximum temperature. In fact, it takes about 4 minutes before it reaches the maximum temperature of around 83 degrees. This is at normal fan speeds. You can avoid this by putting the fan speed up to 100%, in which case it will never reach that. However, if you want a game with a fan at 100%, I wish you all the best. Simply put, this chart shows that over time, rather quickly, card temperature rises to its maximum temperature. And what happens when that happens? Well, if we look at the blue line now, we can quite clearly see that as the temperature rises, around about the 4 minute mark, we are way down at 1700, and then it drops all the way down, right down to the base clock of 1607. 1 or 2 spikes back up as it cools down again. But once you're down here, you're really down here and you're staying down here, yeah? This is why I dislike GPU turbos. They are a nonsense in reality. It's all about getting better benchmark numbers. Again though, if you've got better cooling, or a fan at 100%, you can mostly avoid these issues. There are still dips though. This kind of testing is well worth thinking about when you see a result like over at Hardware Canucks, where the results are a little bit higher than the average we're seeing elsewhere. The reason for this is they're not really testing within cases, or maybe there's some other reason. Take a closer look at the testing when you see results that are a little bit out of the normal. If we go back to Computer Base for another look at this chart, you can see here over at the right hand side that the power target and the temperature target can be raised. So instead of 83 degrees, the maximum temperature of the card can be raised to 92 degrees, and it will now no longer be thermally limited. And once we get past that point, the card does generally run at 1785 MHz, rather than the average of around 1667, using the 83 degrees and normal power target. There is no such thing as a free lunch, of course. And when you run the card at maximum, the power also increases. As we can see here, from a quite frugal 244 watts, which is similar to the GTX 970, That is pretty impressive performance per watt when you consider it's probably twice as fast as the GTX 970 for around the same watts. However, once you raise the temperature and power target, you're also adding another 40 watts of power and of course higher temperatures. So up until this point, you have seen the GTX 1080 Founders Edition benchmarked against reference cards. I'm pretty sure you're all aware that most of these sites have been benchmarking partner cards, aftermarket, factory overclocked graphics cards for quite a few years now. And while most in the press avoided making that comparison, over at PC Games Hardware, they benchmarked the GTX 1080 against a Titan X at 1500MHz, a 980 Ti at 1430MHz, and the Fury X at 1150MHz, which is actually overclocked and not at stock. I just forgot to remove that from the graph. And here is the first big surprise. This was quite a few games tested, and over the piece, the 1500MHz Titan X at 1440p was 9% faster than the GTX 1080. The GTX 1080 only beat the 980 Ti 1430MHz, I believe that's the MSI Lightning version, by 3% and had a very good 32% victory over the Fury X, which we know cannot overclock for shit. Moving up to 4K, the Titan X actually pulls away and now wins by 10%. The gap to the 980 Ti Lightning is down to 2%, and even the Fury X has narrowed the gap down to 25%. Now you may look at the Titan X at 1500MHz and think that's not a very fair test. How many of you have Titan X's at 1500MHz? But the fact remains, they do exist. Probably the more relevant one, however, is of course the 980 Ti at 1430MHz. A lot of you guys will have 980 Ti's at 1430MHz. And effectively, you would be looking at almost identical performance to this GTX 1080 Founders Edition. When you see it like this, it really does bring some perspective to the card, especially when you compare it to some of the other results where you see 35% faster, stuff like that, than the 980 Ti. Yeah, that's fine. If you're running a reference 980 Ti, then sure, in an open bench, this card could be 35% faster than the 980 Ti. Otherwise, you're looking at closer to 2 to 5%. Quite a few of you suggested that the 1080 would be the first true 4K capable graphics card. And here is the average FPS taken over a bunch of websites. And when you look at it like this, it is definitely getting there. Fallout 4 49 FPS, Rise of the Tomb Raider 45, Star Wars Battlefront 51, The Division 40, Hitman 47, Doom 59, Far Cry Primal 44, Anno 2205 48, Grand Theft Auto 5 at 58, and The Witcher 3 at 40 average frames per second. It's sort of in that range now where G-Sync monitors, 4K G-Sync monitors, it's almost getting there. This is the average though, so don't forget you are going to see dips down below 30s quite a lot. I still feel that this is not a true 4K graphics card. We're going to have to wait on GP102 and Vega for that purpose. Or maybe you've got a Titan X around 1500MHz, in which case I would hold on to that for now. Right, so that's about all the information which is relevant regarding this Founders Edition graphics card. And this is the point about this review here. It's supposed to be reviewing a graphics card. Too many in the press have been reviewing a graphics chip or a graphics card company. This GP104, the GTX 1080 GPU, should provide a much better graphics card and a decent aftermarket factory overclocked card. It's not a fantastic overclocker. Steve over at Gamers Nexus ran a hybrid cooler through it and only got to about 2150MHz. So even when it's not limited by temperatures or power, the card isn't really reaching those heights of the previous Maxwell generation. Obviously it's clocking a lot higher, however on a percentage basis, relative to the base clocks, the Maxwell generation of cards are better overclockers. If you bought a 980 Ti, a good quality aftermarket 980 Ti, then I feel that you're still laughing about that because you've still got a beast of a graphics card and there is zero requirement to upgrade to this 1080, which really leaves me with an issue with this card. It can easily beat the GTX 980. If you overclock both cards, then it's probably only going to be about 50% faster than the GTX 980, which is still pretty good. But then you look at the price of $700. You paid what, $550 18 months ago for that GTX 980. Are you now going to pay another $700 for this? Not for the Founders Edition, you're not. That doesn't really make any sense to me. At least wait until we see the aftermarket cards, hopefully coming down in price a bit to something closer like the price of the GTX 980. Now I really like the GTX 980, but I've always felt it's overpriced. But the price of this Founders Edition card is just absolutely stupid. And given what you've seen here, I can think of zero good reasons why anybody would want to pull the trigger and buy this card. The rest of the tech press is fawning over it, based on what it may be capable of with good aftermarket cooling. But this is not a good card. High temperatures and throttling are not desirable characteristics of a graphics card, and certainly not one you just paid $700 for. Right, so the very last thing is I have a copy of the new game from Misfits called Duskers to give away. Quite often I get sent review copies of games, but you probably notice I'm doing more technology videos these days. I hardly get time to play anything. So I emailed them back and said, do you mind if I give the game away? And they said, yeah, sure. On Steam it is very well received. It's had very positive reviews of 96%. It's some kind of roguelike strategy thing. Not really my type of game, but if it's your type of game and you would like a chance of winning a copy of it, just leave a comment below. You can talk about the video, you can say, just give me the game already, or whatever you want. And I will pick the winner at random and announce it very soon. But that's it for this one. There's quite a lot of research goes into these videos, yeah. I need to read through practically every single review on the web. But anyway, check out the description below. I've got Amazon links there that you can use if you want to support the channel. There's going to be another couple of videos this month, but next month is going to be a big one for me. I'll let y'all take a guess at what that means. I'll catch you later, guys.